Want to bring in Ebony Bennett from the Australian Institute for more analysis. Ebony, lovely to have your company today. Now, this breaking news coming in, the International Criminal Court has confirmed that it is opening this active investigation here. What's the significance of this?
I think it's significant that so many countries have joined together to make the referral. That sends a very strong message, and of course important because this is a situation that's unfolding, as we speak, and we can see that more than 2,000 Ukrainian civilians have already been killed since Russia began its invasion of Ukraine. It certainly looks from the video footage that we're seeing and from all reports like civilians are potentially being targeted, civilian buildings have been targeted in bombing strikes and things like that. So it's important that the investigation can begin now and collect evidence, but unfortunately, I'm not sure it's going to do much to stop Russia's aggression. In the meantime, we, though, are certainly seeing that I think the Russian forces have been surprised by the strength and determination of Ukrainian resistance, and certainly military and defense experts have been very critical of Russia's invasion in itself. It hasn't been as successful as Vladimir Putin would have hoped, and considering Russia's superiority in terms of firepower and overwhelming force, what the Ukrainian military has been able to achieve so far is extraordinary, but the outcome is looking very bleak for Ukrainians. A lot of cities being targeted now with aerial bombardment, which is just devastating for the civilian population. So while the investigation from the ICC is welcome, it's not going to do much for Ukrainians on the ground right now, unfortunately.
As you've mentioned, the investigation, it's monumental that it is underway, but for the meantime, we are seeing further attacks in Kyiv, the capital there, as well as they're moving in from most directions except the west at this stage. Now, arguably, the biggest risk for the world right now is the threat of a nuclear crisis. We're seeing Russia continue to take over those nuclear power plants. What's the motive behind this? Is the world facing a nuclear catastrophe? And if so, how can they deter Putin from this point forward?
Yeah, it really is a potential catastrophe. The fact that President Putin would threaten the Ukraine with nuclear options on the table is both immoral and unconscionable. It's a threat to humanity and needs to be called out as such. And it really goes to show that all it takes is one determined dictator to threaten all of humanity when it comes to nuclear weaponry. So it's something that we have to take incredibly seriously, and it's important that the global community really takes on now an urgent need to recommit itself to demilitarization and removing nuclear weaponry from the table. We have to have a new movement for disarmament and arms control because while ever these types of weapons exist, they remain a threat to all of humanity. We've had decades of peace where this was really off the table, and efforts at disarmament have kind of been in the background. And I think this just goes to show the whole community has to pull together, the global community, to really put arms control and nuclear disarmament back as a serious agenda item for us to achieve urgently.
Well, we're seeing these wide-ranging sanctions, economic sanctions being imposed. Russian oligarchs are being sanctioned as well. I know there was a billionaire who was just sanctioned in Germany. His yacht was sanctioned as well. But all of these economic sanctions don't seem to be deterring Putin at this point. We heard from US Pentagon Press Secretary John Kirby, and he seemed quite deflated there, saying that, there is only so much the US can do. They won't be moving troops into the region. They will continue to seek these economic sanctions. But is that enough? Can Putin actually be deterred from this point forward?
Well, I think as far as sanctions go, we're just going to have to level up to things that are going to be basically more detrimental, not only to Russia, but to countries imposing sanctions as well. Most of them have been targeted economically at Russia's finance sector, but there have certainly been calls to target Russia's oil and gas exports, where a lot of its wealth comes from. It's certainly been weaponizing its gas exports against Europe and Ukraine in this instance, and threatening, to cut off supplies to Europe. And that will obviously cut both ways. If we do target oil and gas exports from Russia, it will certainly inflict much more damage on Russia. But consequently, it will lead obviously to higher petrol prices and other impacts for nations that rely on that energy. So I think those types of sanctions are still on the table, but they will cut both ways.
I wanted to ask you, there's a picture that's going viral. It's of a Russian soldier and he was injured and he actually turned himself into the Ukrainian people for food, for tea. They gave him their phone to reach out to his mum to let his mum know that he was safe. We've seen a Russian official, an advisor, come out today and resign, saying that he won't stand by the government while they do this to Ukraine. We're seeing protesters in Russia at the moment being arrested and dragged away for standing up against this here. We've seen TV Rain and other TV networks in Russia being silenced and cancelled here for speaking out on what's happening. What's going on here, do you think? Do you think we will see an uprising of the Russian people?
Hope so, but obviously it's an autocratic regime headed by a dictator who ruthlessly cracks down on democracy and free speech wherever it appears. But I've been very hopeful to see people demonstrating out on the streets in Russia, and I think Ukraine has been very smart to take these Russian soldiers who have surrendered, get them to call home, because of course in Putin's Russia, a free press isn't in existence, so people aren't hearing the truth about what is happening in Ukraine. They're being fed propaganda. So I think it's so important that, tennis players, people from the Russian diaspora who are outside the country, people within the country who have access to this type of information are getting it out there as far as possible. And it's truly heartening to see the bravery of Russian citizens who oppose this war, who do not want to see Russia engaging in this type of aggression against their near neighbours, some of whom have holidayed or grown up or studied in Ukraine, I think will be really important. But I don't think we can underestimate how repressive Vladimir Putin's regime is. And as you've said, we've seen hundreds of arrests, which is really designed to prevent any of this type of open opposition to Vladimir Putin from, infecting the rest of the nation, essentially. So we can only hope. But yeah, it's who knows? Well, time will only tell if it will be enough.
The bottom 20% get nothing. They're really unfair tax cuts.
People want to see much stronger action from the government when it comes to climate change.
It's no coincidence that we have a wages crisis in Australia.
Transitioning to net zero emissions, it doesn't seem like there's much room for gas.